the newsagents.
You know, the political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down. We all have a responsibility to do that. Yes, we have deeply felt strong disagreements. The stakes in this election are enormously high. I've said it many times that the choice in this election we make in this election is going to shape the future of America and the world for decades to come. I believe that with all my soul. I know that millions of my fellow Americans believe it as well, and some have a different view as to the direction our country should take. Disagreement is inevitable in American democracy. It's part of human nature, but politics must never be a literal battlefield, and God forbid, a killing field.
We are just 36 hours on from the moment a bullet missed Donald Trump's head by millimetres. And Joe Biden last night took to the Oval Office to call for a reset, to calm down the language. Donald Trump's done the same thing, calling for unity, ripping up one convention speech to write another. But why are we shocked that this has even happened? We know what America is like. We know the political violence sown into the very fabric of this culture, with its gun violence to boot. So is anyone really expecting things to change here in Milwaukee this week? Welcome to the News Agency.
It's John. It's Lewis.
It's Emily. And we are at the Republican convention in Milwaukee. Security is, as you can imagine, tight. Queues are long. We spent an hour 45 in our car this morning, a vehicle that was cleared for special parking, before just ditching it and legging it on foot. And that is as a result, partially, of course, of the effects of Saturday night. There are questions here that are dominating the airwaves as to how that shooter could have somehow fired the shots 150 metres away from the stage on which President Trump was standing. And I don't think people have quite figured out in their heads yet how that was allowed to happen, how the sniper managed to get access to that roof despite being on the security forces' radar as soon as he was near the perimeter of the event in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and Emily, Lewis and I are in the studio in London. You're there in Milwaukee, and I know we've both attended, these conventions before. I can only imagine the change of atmosphere, because these things are kind of normally joyous, a time to, hoopla and putting on a big show. And I would imagine there's a sort of rather more somber atmosphere.
It's a very odd thing, but I would say that sometimes it pays to be an outsider at these things, because it helps you see things differently. There is no question, I think, that there are large parts of America in shock, maybe even distress over what happened on Saturday night. One man was killed for going to support his chosen electoral candidate in that crowd. 2 others remain critically ill. The former president was shot at in what we must assume was an attempt to kill him. But what is odd, I think, is that this consensus has developed amongst the political class that this is all to do with the political climate and toxic language. Speaker Mike Johnson's just walked past our desk here, and he was the first out the traps, calling on everyone to turn the rhetoric down, whatever that means, and immediately segueing into this rebuke of Joe Biden for using a target metaphor when Biden said on a phone call to donors last week, it's time to put Trump in a bullseye. Trump has now reportedly ripped up the speech he was going to give at the convention this week. He's rewritten it to sort of appeal for unity. Biden has taken to the Oval Office to show leadership, to remind everyone in America he was the original unity candidate back in 2016. And so you're right, there is this kind of mawkish, I'm going to say, reverence that's descended on the breakfast shows, with commentators, politicians talking about, a time for healing, looking for the better angels. These phrases pulled from the language of Abraham Lincoln have been used so many times before. But no one is talking about guns, as if that debate has been and gone so many times they don't really have the energy to start it up. And so, in a way, the extraordinary thing is that America is shocked by what happened here. And I think the rest of the world is not so shocked. It's hard to know, what this means, obviously, for Donald Trump, who came seconds and millimeters away from a bullet to the brain. Maybe he is having a Damascene conversion, or maybe this is something that actually the rest of the world has understood as part of America's very fabric, but they're still kind of paying lip service to this idea today of unity and an end to division and an end to the toxic language, which, quite frankly, is never going to happen.
Well, let's hear now from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who was on the Today Show this morning.
It's an objective truth that Donald Trump is probably the most persecuted and attacked political figure in history, certainly among presidents, maybe at least since Abraham Lincoln, Civil War era. And that takes a toll. I mean, when my colleagues go out, Democrat colleagues, and say democracy will end, the republic will be in an emergency stage if Donald Trump wins for president, it's just not true. It's another election. And when they say that kind of rhetoric and they heat it up like that, there are people out there that take these things to heart and they act upon them. Politicians are not responsible for that, but we do have a responsibility to be responsible. I mean, we're not asking for much. Let's just dial the rhetoric down. Let's have a vigorous debate. That's what our country's built upon, but we have to see one another as fellow Americans and not enemies.
I think what we can see in terms of the immediate political implications, even by comparison to when we were talking about this yesterday, and I'm sure Emily, you're seeing it there, is in terms of Trump's own internal political position within the Republican Party. It was his party anyway, but the idea of there being any kind of opposition to him, internal opposition, whatever was left of that has disappeared. I mean, very telling that Nikki Haley, for example, of course, who was the last, kind of holdout during the primary process against Trump, she's involved in the convention this week. Yeah. This shooting, he was already a folk hero for so many Republicans, MAGA Republicans, but it has continued this process of the beatification of the man, right? I mean, he is literally being held up, in some senses, still in quasi-religious terms as a result of what happened yesterday. The martyrdom of Donald Trump continues to empower and enhance his power within the Republican Party. You couldn't write it.
I think that is spot on. And what no one is saying out loud, at least, is that all this talk of unity serves both candidates very well indeed. Trump's team has studied the lessons of the Reagan assassination attempt in 1981. They have seen how that president rose in stature, found the right tone, the right words for his own miracle miss, and saw the poll bounce as a result. And Biden, don't forget, has now faced, 17 days of his own party calling in ever more urgent terms for him to go. And this allows him, if you like, a moment to pause and reset. So the language of each campaign is reflected in the other. For Trump, it allows, as you say, this sort of majestic rising, like the phoenix from the ashes, this almost messianic stance that he's doing it for America, that he's proving he can rise again, literally. And he is taking that, let's say, metaphorical fight to the people to say, you can't bow me down like this. For Joe Biden, this has come at a really convenient time, because if you remember Biden's inauguration speech 4 years ago, he stood on that podium promising unity. And so imagine now, he's got the Oval Office. He is making the, dare I say, teleprompted speech, which reminds everyone that he is meant to be the unity candidate. Maybe it takes an outsider to say, let's just see how long that lasts. Because as everyone knows, the convention is a red meat place. It is full of people getting angry and shouty and passionate and furious. When we were here 8 years ago, we heard Rudy Giuliani getting the crowd to chant the phrase about Hillary Clinton, lock her up. They were banging their feet, they were clapping, they were slapping the chairs. They wanted them riled up and angry and passionate. And that has been the language that Trump's MAGA crowd have used very effectively for 8 years. So I guess the question is he going to appeal to a new section of society with this, a more conservative, Haley-esque America he might bring on side? Or is he just going to start out like that before bringing in the bass and the red meat and the chanting and the shouting? It's all to play for, but we're only 36 hours in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that I've read a lot of commentary from people saying you don't get shot at or have someone try to kill you without it changing fundamentally who you are and what your values are. And I think, well, kind of up to a point, maybe.
Reminds me a lot of exactly what people said about Boris Johnson when he went into intensive care during Partygate.
Or what it said to exactly the same about Donald Trump when he was helicoptered out of the White House to go to Walter Reed Hospital when he had COVID. Or before that, when he won the 2016 election and everyone was saying that the presidency will change Donald Trump. Donald Trump won't change the presidency. I'm going to say that age 78, Donald Trump is who he is and isn't going to change. And furthermore, I would just add to that look, Donald Trump, as we saw in that instinctive, visceral reaction in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, it was to see the campaign opportunity of a lifetime to put up a clenched fist with his bloodied face and shout, fight, fight, fight. And I think that is Donald Trump. He has seen a political and strategic opportunity, and I think so far the Republicans are playing it well. But the idea, to use the Bible, that this is some Damascene conversion of Donald Trump, not so sure.
But what he can do, I mean, this is the thing, he's clearly not going to change. But what he has done, and one way in which you could argue he has changed a bit of late, is that his political nous has become sharper in the sense that he has shown more dexterity, more flexibility, more willingness to shut up when the political moment allows it. So although clearly this shooting isn't going to fundamentally change his political makeup or character in any way, if he comes out this week and does a thing that actually most Americans and most people will be very surprised about, which is not come out all fire and fury and political bloodlust, but say that this is a moment to come together, this is a moment to unite, then suddenly the Republican tent gets bigger, which is precisely the one thing that has eluded the Trump project, at least since 2020.
Look, I think he's already finding it quite difficult to stick to the script. And make no mistake, I think it is a script. He told the New York Post, the kind of, the tabloid Murdoch-owned paper here, that he had ripped up his old speech, and then he told them it was a humdinger of a speech. In other words, it had plenty of stuff in it that was really going to rally the base. But the fact that he actually had to tell people, the fact that he told journalists, oh my God, you should have seen the one that got away. What a shame I couldn't deliver that because I've got to do this one, suggests that there is an inner Trump bursting to come out. And I think, we've partly referred to this, I guess, but when you hear that phrase, better angels, the poetry of Abraham Lincoln, who was himself, of course, assassinated, you have to remember that they've used those phrases here for decades after shooting incidents. They used it after Gabby Giffords, the Democrat, nearly paralysed, had a brain injury after a shooting. They used it after Steve Scalise, you mentioned on the episode yesterday, was really badly injured in a baseball match. And so there is this kind of weirdness in America which makes it disassociate itself from the America we all know. When people say this is not who we are, the rest of the world's going, hello, I'm sorry, I think it is.
Well, look, I just, a piece of breaking news while we're recording this, which is the sort of parallel universe of where we are now and where we were 36 hours or longer ago. Judge Aileen Cannon, who was going to hear the classified documents trial against Donald Trump over his keeping classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, has announced that she is dropping the case against Donald Trump. In a ruling, she said that the appointment of special counsel Jack Smith violated the Constitution. In the end, it seems the executive's growing comfort in appointing regulatory special counsels, does little for judicial scrutiny. So there you are.
It's all coming up, Donald.
It's all coming up, Donald, right now, isn't it?
And I'm going to word this carefully here. There are many people who will say that dreadful phrase, now is not the time. Let's not look to blame the victim for what he did over January the 6th. Let's not look to blame the victim over the incendiary language he used over Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, who was attacked in his own home by a hammer. Let's not blame the victim, etc., for things he couldn't have controlled in his documents case or, stealing things and taking them to Mar-a-Lago. And I think that will be the abiding narrative here. It will be much harder for people like us, for journalists, to ask questions, to actually interrogate the politicians here more closely, because we will be told now is not the time, now is a time for healing. And that, I think, is going to stick in the craw.
Trump has basically for a decade been the biggest force for unity among Democrats, right? That is what Trump and the fear of Trump is the thing that has gelled the Democrats together. It's been the adhesive, right? Now, with the Republicans gathering in Milwaukee, basically that's been reversed. Trump has become the biggest source of unity for his own party, whereas previously he had been the source of disunity. And Biden, who had been the tool to defeat Trump and therefore a big source of unity for the Democrats, has become the source of disunity for the Democratic Party. So the party positions have reversed. The internal political position of both men vis-a-vis their own parties has reversed. And of course, while all of this is going on for Trump, and he's going to do this sort of magisterial tour over the course of the next week, Biden is still in a position where, although the pressure has lessened on him, he's still having to try and fight for the nomination of his own party, which technically already secured. I mean, he's doing an interview tonight with NBC with Lester Holt, right? Again, he did the White House address, Oval Office address last night. Again, each and every time, everyone's still waiting to see whether he slips up. So the two men, it seems to me, have had the most remarkable turnaround in terms of the positions they themselves occupy within their own parties.
Look, every election is a referendum on something. And in 2020, Joe Biden very successfully made it about a referendum on Donald Trump's period in office. And this coalition was forged with white college-educated women, the suburbs, independents, liberal Republicans who could not bring themselves to vote for any more of the chaos. 2024 is now going to be a referendum about Joe Biden and his fitness for office, and that is the worst place that Democratic Party strategists wanted to be in July. They wanted this to still be about Donald Trump. Well, if it's about Donald Trump, there's a lot of sympathy going his way, and if they want it to be about Biden, it's toxic because of all the missteps that we've seen from the president over the past few weeks, and that makes it a really hazardous time for the Democrats to be kind of trying to fight Donald Trump.
And I think that's why, yes, the Democrats may leave Joe Biden alone for this week. There is going to be that sort of, period of pause. But after that, I think they will reckon it becomes even more imperative that they find somebody who can take the fight to Donald Trump, because his job's just got a whole lot easier. And all the questions that were circling around Kamala Harris having much lower approval ratings, fearing much worse in the polls than Joe Biden, have now started to shift. And actually in the swing states, she polls better than Joe Biden. And if they think about this being almost the end of the fight for Donald Trump, they might think, well, what have we got to lose, actually, by doing this, by one last heave? What have we got to lose by having a go at resetting the narrative one final time? Because, as you say, at the moment it all lies with Trump. And back to your point about Aileen Cannon, I mean, for now at least, I do think it becomes harder for the legislators, for the prosecutors, for those who are actually looking at these cases to try and make the case against Donald Trump, whose victimhood now is off the charts.
So, Maitlis, now that you've got through security, I presume you're never going to go back to your hotel and you're just going to camp out
Sleep here.
Conference centre for the next 3 or 4 days. What do the next 3 or 4 days look like? Because I don't think Trump speaks until Thursday, does he?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, in the sort of the setting of the bride is meant to wait until the wedding to be seen. I wouldn't be surprised if we got something from Trump either today or tomorrow, a surprise one. We're still waiting to hear who his VP pick is. I mean, I don't think we've seen that before, that a candidate would go to his own convention without pre-announcing his pick for vice president. That's going to be exciting. There's lots of different groups. I should tell you, sadly, we have just been turned down by the Heritage Foundation, the body that has supported our dear Liz Truss so well in her endeavours in the US.
That is a surprise.
I know. We tried to get access to hear their talk. Not forthcoming so far, but there's quite a lot of fringe groups, Mums for America, Mums for Jesus, the kind of Republican sort of heavyweight meetings which are where it all goes on. But I guess there is only going to be one topic of conversation for now, until he actually announces the VP pick. And we are hearing from Nikki Haley on the stage, as you said. Don Jr. is speaking. J.D. Vance, who many think has got the best chance of being the pick. I think a lot of the characters that you will have sort of seen in Donald Trump's aura will be popping up on stage here, and they will all be saluting a man they are now seeing as quasi-martyr.
Well, we will be back after the break with Nick Bryant, historian, broadcaster, friend, about his new book about how America is at war with itself. And the book was written before the events in Pennsylvania. That's coming up. We're joined now by my former colleague from the US, Nick Bryant, who now lives in Australia, but one of the great students of American politics, and kind of weirdly, coincidentally, has just written a new book that comes out this week about America being at war with itself. And here we are, kind of 36 hours after an attempted assassination of the Republican nominee for president. Nick, it was very interesting that Joe Biden talked about this being kind of unheard of in American history. And then you kind of look at American history and you think it's anything but unheard of.
Violence has been the continual thread of American history right from the very beginning. A lot of people tend to forget this, but the first House Speaker survived an assassination attempt. Donald Trump's great presidential hero and presidential soulmate, the populist president Andrew Jackson, he survived an assassination attempt on Capitol Hill. Davy Crockett actually came to his rescue. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, John F. Kennedy, all assassinated while in office. Then there are the presidents who survived assassination attempts. Harry S. Truman, FDR, just before he was sworn in 1933. Theodore Roosevelt, as he was campaigning for a return to the White House, like Donald Trump. Only the pages of his speech managed to save his life. Gerald Ford, within the space of 17 days, became the target of two separate assassination attempts, both conducted by women, curiously. And then, of course, in 1981, that famous assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. To say this is unheard of, I wonder whether it spoke of his cognitive decline, but I think it speaks of a bigger problem, John, which is this historical amnesia. Americans try to sort of forget and erase the violent history that so often makes sense of the violent present.
So why? Why is there such a history of violence in this country which likes to think of itself as being exceptional and talks endlessly of American exceptionalism?
Well, violence is actually a sign of America's negative exceptionalism rather than its positive exceptionalism. And I think America's sense of itself as positively exceptional actually makes it blind to the history that shows that it is very different from other countries, but often in very negative ways. It's really interesting. The 1960s were a particularly violent decade. We had the assassination of John F. Kennedy. We had the assassination of his brother, Robert Kennedy, just weeks after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Malcolm X was killed in the 1960s as well. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the president at the time, decided he wanted to undertake a quest for understanding. And he brought together a bunch of historians and scholars to actually look into this problem. And what they found was that there was a sense of vigilantism that was very deep-rooted in the American psyche, partly because of the attempt early on to drive Native Americans and Mexicans off their land. They found that racism was often at the heart of American political violence. They found that the idea of political violence was legitimized by the very way in which America came into being, which was through a violent revolution overthrowing the British. And obviously the availability of guns as well. The fact that the country was awash with guns was another factor. But what they also found was that Americans tend to erase all this from their history. They absolutely cited this idea that there was a problem of historical amnesia. And what they said was that Americans are so believe this kind of messianic story that America likes to tell itself, that the United States is the new Jerusalem, that they don't actually willingly face up to the history that contradicts that grand narrative.
Do you think, Nick, that in the wake of what's happened to Trump, that amnesia is still possible? or that it is still possible, at least for the period of this presidential election, to continue to avert Americans' gaze and its sort of political gaze?
Well, what strikes me about the president is, and this idea that, wow, how did this happen? I mean, I just fell back on a formulation that I continually used during the Trump years, and I'm sure you did too, John, when you were in Washington. It was shocking, but it wasn't surprising. In recent times, I mean, people are saying that, this is the first assassination attempt since Reagan, but, you tend to forget that Barack Obama had 3 times the number of political threats against him than previous presidents. He used to get over 30 death threats a day. Michelle Obama became the first US First Lady to have one of those SWAT teams assigned to her, the guys that you saw take to the stage after Trump was shot at, wearing the combat fatigues. People have short memories when it comes to the attack on the Pelosi household. A guy was trying to kidnap Nancy Pelosi. He ended up bludgeoning her husband, Paul Pelosi, with a hammer. People easily forget what happened in Michigan with the kidnap plot against the Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer. People forgot what happened to Gabrielle Gifford in Arizona, the Democratic congressman who came under attack. People forget the attack on the Republican congressional baseball team in Alexandria, Virginia. So much of this has happened that, again, when it happened on Saturday night, I kind of looked at it and thought, wow, this is so shocking. But it's also so unsurprising.
But is it partly unsurprising as a result of Trump himself? In the sense that, I mean, you're right, you can list lots of recent events which have involved political violence or the threat of political violence in some way. You can take the big historic sweep of American history and say this is a country that has historically had lots of paramilitarism, that it has had a frontier which was untamed and which therefore relied on individuals to sort of use violence because the state was a sort of distant presence. You can sort of take that big historical sweep, but Trump himself has surely taken things to a different place, right? In the sense that something that hadn't happened recently, at least in previous decades, were that elections themselves could be sites of political violence and expressions of political violence, which we've seen in the post-2020 January the 6th world.
Yeah, violent rhetoric has always been a core part of Trump's political messaging and part of the bonding mechanism that he's had with his base. When he told people at rallies to knock the crap out of people who were trying to disrupt them, he was saying something that a previous presidential candidate wouldn't have said, and that was obviously part of Trump's appeal. He would say things that were previously unsayable. And violent imagery has also been part of Trump iconography. There are a lot of memes with Trump as the Terminator. There are a lot of memes with Trump as Rambo. Trump himself once retweeted a picture of him with his head imposed on Sylvester Stallone's body. He was seeing himself as Rocky. And now, of course, he has the iconography of that shot, which is just so extraordinary. The fist held aloft, having just shouted "fight, fight, fight" with an American flag fluttering overhead. He doesn't need to rely on borrowed iconography anymore. He has his own. I think another thing that was cited by that report back in the 60s was this idea of legitimate violence. This idea of a revolutionary ideology which justifies acts of political violence. Me and John have spoken about this before. We were struck by how many people on January the 6th were shouting 1776. They really regarded themselves not as insurrectionists, but patriots acting very much in the spirit of the American Revolutionary. And these weren't just sort of blue-collar MAGA blowhards. A lot of these people were highly educated, very prosperous, who did believe that political violence is legitimate.
So do you buy into the idea now, Nick, that what we are going to see at the Republican convention in Milwaukee, which is getting underway today, a new redefined Donald Trump, inclusive, against division, the nation must come together, that the shooting has somehow kind of shaken up the kaleidoscope and it's settled in a place where Donald Trump is a much more conciliatory figure?
I think ever since the first 5 minutes of the presidential debate, Donald Trump has been a different candidate. He has realized that Joe Biden is losing this election so that he doesn't have to win it. it struck me how he kind of reined himself and dialed himself back during that presidential debate, because he realized he didn't have to land blows on Biden because Biden was inflicting so much self-harm. And in the weeks since that disastrous debate performance, he's been on the golf course for much of the time, of course. He really hasn't seen the need to campaign because the Democrats were just imploding. And I think he'll be smart in this moment as well. He'll dial down the rhetoric. He'll realize he won't have to give the kind of belligerent speech that is the sort of typical fare and what he would have ordinarily done at the GOP convention. And for Biden, of course, it's this massive political problem. In 2020, it wasn't so much a Biden coalition that won the presidency. It was an anti-Trump coalition that won in the presidency. And that anti-Trump coalition becomes so much harder to reassemble in the aftermath of Pennsylvania.
Nick, fantastic to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed.
John, it's great to speak to you. And Lewis, fantastic to speak to you as well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, John, I suppose we can't not end the show today without talking a little bit about the sadness that's enveloping the country.
The sadness that on the tube last night, coming back from watching the game at a pub. Can you imagine? A lot of people.
London was like Ibiza before the match, and then
before
it was
the
like,
match,
and then it was
very different.
and then it was a wet Friday in Skegness for after the match.
But
Honestly,
the question is, look, this is a largely political podcast. The question is,
yes, I think that's fair.
Is the honeymoon over for Sir Keir Starmer? He goes to Berlin. It's all been going so well, and the wheels came off the wagon.
Oh, that's all downhill from here.
Yeah, all downhill.
I think we all know who's responsible. Old Jinxie Starmer. Jinxie Keir. Well, never mind.
But can you imagine what it must be like to be Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister?
I often wonder that.
Wow, what a day for Spanish self-esteem it was yesterday.
But I always wonder, I don't know, because I don't know enough about kind of the psychology of this thing, but like, Spain have won 3 times before, right? It's their 4th time.
Yeah.
Maybe they care less.
Yeah, but the fact is...
we really care, right? Now it's going to be 60 years of hurt or whatever.
The fact is, you had Carlos Alcaraz winning Wimbledon in
it
straight
was a good day for
sets
Spanish
against
sport.
Djokovic. You then have Spain winning the Euros last night in Berlin. I mean, does it get much better than that?
They're annoying, aren't they? They've got it all. They've got the sun, they've got the Rioja, they've got the sport.
Yeah, exactly.
They've got the chorizo. What have we got? What have we got, John?
I don't know. We've got Blackpool Beach.
We've got Blackpool Beach and black pudding. And that's enough for me.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.